If you've spent any time making arguments for God based on science, you've probably heard this objection thrown back at you, usually with a bit of a smirk. That's just a god of the gaps. The accusation goes like this. Throughout history, whenever people didn't understand something, lightning, disease, the movement of the planets, they credited God. And every single time science eventually came along, explained the mechanism, and the God explanation quietly disappeared. So the argument goes, using God to explain the origin of life, or fine-tuning, or consciousness is just repeating the same mistake. It's filling in a temporary gap in knowledge with a permanent lazy answer, and history says that gap is going to close eventually, just like all the others. It's a fair criticism to take seriously. It has real history behind it. But today, we're going to look closely at why it doesn't actually apply to the strongest design arguments in the God and science conversation, and what the real important difference is between a lazy gap filler and a legitimate scientific inference. Let's give this objection its due, because it's not a straw man, it's earned. Ancient and even fairly recent cultures really did explain natural phenomena by directly appealing to divine action, in ways science later replaced with mechanism. Thunder was the anger of a god, until we understood electrical discharge. Diseases were curses or spiritual punishment, until germ theory gave us a mechanistic, testable explanation. Even devout scientists have occasionally been guilty of this move, pointing to some unexplained phenomenon and saying, well, that must be God, instead of continuing to dig for a natural explanation that, given more time and better instruments, eventually turned up. That pattern is real, and it should make us cautious. If someone's entire argument for God rests on science hasn't explained this yet, that argument is genuinely fragile, because science has a strong track record of eventually explaining things it once couldn't, and a faith built on permanent scientific ignorance is a faith standing on ground that keeps shrinking. So the objection is doing real work. The question is whether it applies to every argument that connects science and God, or only to a specific, weaker kind of argument. Here's the distinction that the God of the gaps objection usually misses entirely, and it's the whole hinge of this episode. A genuine gap argument says, we don't currently have a natural explanation for X, therefore God did X. That's an argument from ignorance. It's built on the absence of an answer, and it gets weaker every time science learns more, because the whole argument was standing on empty space. But the strongest design arguments in this space don't actually work that way, and it's worth being precise about the difference. They don't say, we don't know how this happened, therefore God. They say, here is a specific positive feature of what we do know, a pattern that, in every other context we recognize, is a reliable marker of a mind at work, and that pattern is present here. So an intelligent cause is the better explanation for the evidence we actually have, not the evidence we're missing. Take the genetic code as an example. This isn't an argument from a gap in our knowledge, quite the opposite. The more molecular biology has advanced, the more precisely we've been able to map out just how information-rich and language-like DNA actually is. A 4-letter chemical alphabet, arranged in specific, functional sequences, read by molecular machinery, translated into proteins that fold into precise 3-dimensional shapes to do exact jobs. That's not an absence of explanation. That's a presence of exactly the kind of pattern, specified, functional information, that in every other case we encounter, from computer code to written language, we already know only comes from a mind. The argument isn't, we don't understand DNA, so God did it. The argument is, we understand DNA extremely well, and what we understand about it looks exactly like the kind of thing minds produce, and nothing else does. That's a completely different logical structure than pointing at ignorance and inserting God into the blank space. Let's apply the same distinction to fine-tuning. Since it's one of the most common science and God arguments out there, and it gets accused of being a gap argument constantly, usually unfairly. The fine-tuning argument doesn't say, "We don't know why gravity has the strength it does, therefore God said it." It says something much more specific. Physicists have measured these constants extremely precisely, and they've calculated with real mathematics just how narrow the life-permitting range for each one actually is. That's not a mystery being papered over. That's a known, quantified, understood fact about the universe. And the argument is that a universe finely calibrated with that degree of precision is more probable under a design hypothesis than under a chance hypothesis. Again, not an argument from what we don't know. An argument from something we've measured and do know, and what best explains it. This is exactly why fine-tuning arguments have held up well over decades of advancing physics, while genuine gap arguments have historically collapsed the moment new data came in. Physicists haven't been closing the fine-tuning gap by finding some mundane mechanistic reason. Gravity has to be exactly that strength. If anything, better measurements have made the required precision look even tighter, not looser. A real gap argument gets weaker as science advances. This argument, built on positive evidence rather than absence, hasn't. Now, in fairness, it's worth being honest that not every argument Christians make in this space is equally strong, and some really do lean closer to gap filling than they should. If someone's entire case rests on, "Scientists haven't figured out abiogenesis yet, so it must be a miracle," and stops there, without pointing to any positive structural reason, chemistry alone struggles with the problem, that is a weaker, more gap-shaped argument, and it's fair to hold it to a higher standard. The stronger, more careful version of that same argument, the one we walked through a couple videos back, doesn't just point to an absence of a settled answer. It points to a specific positive obstacle, that self-replicating, information-bearing molecules require exactly the kind of specified complexity that unguided chemistry has never been observed to produce on its own, in any lab, under any tested condition. That's a meaningfully different and stronger claim than simply "we don't have an answer yet." Being able to tell these two kinds of arguments apart isn't just a debate tactic. It's intellectual honesty. And honestly, it should matter just as much to a Christian making these arguments as to a skeptic hearing them. So, is faith just a placeholder for what science hasn't explained yet? Sometimes, historically, it has been, and that's a real pattern worth taking seriously and guarding against. But the strongest arguments, connecting design and the God of Scripture, aren't built on ignorance. They're built on precisely the opposite. On the more we learn, the more specific, information-rich, and precisely calibrated the evidence looks. Patterns that, everywhere else we encounter them, point to a mind. That's not a gap being filled. That's a signature being read. Thanks for watching. If this gave you something to think about, consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.